very kind introduction. And hello, everybody. Good afternoon. By now, everyone with any interest in the splendid exhibition that we're celebrating here will have heard of Glasney College outside Penryn. So I thought it might be useful to talk about the college in its own right, to provide some background about the place which is thought to have been connected, whether directly or sometimes only indirectly, the place that's thought to have been connected with all the major works of Cornish literature. The first thing to say is that college doesn't mean an educational or academic establishment. The function of Glasney was not education or scholarship, although it may have done some school teaching as a sideline. The meaning of college was formerly much wider. Its basic meaning was a community. In this case, a community of secular priests, which means they were priests who served in the wider world. The community was not closed in on itself like monks in a monastery. What was it for? Its staff consisted of 13 canons, plus chantry priests, clerks, and boys. We might imagine up to 25 or 30 people together, all men, of course. The 13 canons were parish priests, whose role was to serve the wider community by providing services and the sacraments, daily or weekly masses, baptism, marriage, and funerals. The ownership of various parishes, 16 altogether, all of them in the western half of Cornwall, was given to the college, and its primary role was to provide spiritual care for those parishes. I should say that the parish priests, who were the canons of the college, were allowed to appoint vicars in the parish, so they didn't necessarily spend most of their time in those parishes, but through the vicars they had contact with the parishes, and they were therefore in touch with these parishes in western Cornwall, all the way from St Just in the far west to St Enada and Mevagissey as far east as they went. But that may not have been the only purpose of the college. It may also have had a broader one, but less clearly defined, perhaps even in people's own minds at the time. To understand this speculative role, we need to go one stage further back. The college was founded by the Bishop of Exeter in 1265. In the Middle Ages, and indeed until 150 years ago, for ecclesiastical administrative purposes, Cornwall lay within the Diocese of Exeter, which served all of the 2 counties of Devon and Cornwall. For secular administration, Cornwall was a separate county, but for church administration, it was joined with Devon as a single diocese whose centre lay at Exeter. That diocese was created in the year 1050, but in the following century, the 12th, the Roman Catholic Church tightened up its administrative processes in various ways that had repercussions all over Western Christendom. The canonization of saints became formalized, for example, so there was now an official list of approved saints, which omitted a great many local saints in every country. And the church gained control over marriage so that it became a church matter rather than a civil one. And at the heart of this administrative tightening up lay the parish, the basic unit of church administration. So all over Western Christendom, the role of the parish and its definition became much more important at that period. It was an attempt by the central church administration in Rome to standardize some aspects of life for administrative purposes and for fairness, everywhere from Sicily to Norway and from Poland to the west of Ireland. The whole of Britain and Ireland was a natural part of that standardization process. For many purposes, that won't have been a problem. There was plenty of scope remaining for local variation, and such things as local saint dedications were allowed to continue and often have continued to this day, happily existing within the Roman Catholic Church as well as in the Anglican. But in some places, or for some bishops who might have literalist worries about standardization, that could produce headaches. In 1330, for example, when Glasney College had been flourishing for some 65 years, the then Bishop of Exeter, John Grandison, observing that there seemed to be many saints in Cornwall whom nobody else had heard of, gave instructions that the lives of those saints should be written out in triplicate. One can read this instruction in different ways, depending upon one's preferences. We could see it as taking a kindly interest in the local saints and wanting to encourage people to write up what they knew of them to preserve the information. Or one could see it as a veiled threat. If you can't produce a life of your saint, we may give you a better known one. Or one could see it as neutral, with Bishop Grandison simply wanting to understand better this part of his diocese. In other respects, Grandison is known as rather a strict disciplinarian for orthodox thinking. So in his case, the more threatening of the interpretations may have something in it. But even if that's so, it didn't have any effect, for the local dedications and the names of the churches continued as they had done before. When a Cornish church was dedicated to a better known saint, that saint was usually added rather than replacing the existing local one. That is an example of the kinds of anomaly that were created in the later Middle Ages in a diocese covering 2 English counties with a very different cultural past. But there was another complication in the diocesan administration too, which was the Cornish language. That won't have loomed as large as we might think, for linguistic variation was taken much more for granted in the Middle Ages than it is now. The English spoken in many counties will sometimes have been unintelligible to people from elsewhere in the country. And we often find foreigners trading or having other international dealings in all coastal parts of England without any mention of linguistic difficulties, as if they were just taken in people's stride most of the time. But from the point of view of the Diocese of Exeter, the fact that part of its territory spoke a language very different from English, as well as having other cultural differences, such as the wide range of very local saints, did mean that there could be particular uncertainties in ensuring orthodox beliefs and practices. When Glasney was founded, Cornish was spoken over only half of the county. There was a linguistic boundary running down the middle of the county from Padstow through Bodmin to Foy. East of that line was, as far as we can ascertain, thoroughly English-speaking, and west of that line was bilingual, English and Cornish. The language of the plays, on which our knowledge of the language is based, was only ever the language of half Cornwall. But it so happened that the bishops of Exeter had long owned an estate which lay in the heart of the Cornish-speaking half. Their estate of Treleaver was centred just outside the present campus of Tremoe. It had belonged to the bishops of Exeter since before the Norman conquest, so by the time that Glasney was founded within it, they had owned it for more than 2 centuries. It was the bishops who owned and had fostered the growing town of Penryn, with its national and international trading contacts by sea. And it was here that Bishop Walter Bronscombe chose to create his College of Priests. We can only guess at his motives, but they're hinted at by the fact that the statutes of the college were closely modelled upon those of his Cathedral of Exeter, and that the collegiate church was physically built with decorated stonework which resembled that of the cathedral too. So it's reasonable to suppose that Glasney College was seen as an outpost representing Exeter Cathedral, deliberately sited at a place with excellent transport connections and in the heart of the Cornish-speaking half of Cornwall. Not a cathedral for Cornwall, since Bronscombe would have been in no doubt that Exeter was that, but a physical and spiritual representation of it, a presence of Exeter Cathedral here in Cornwall. Thinking of Glasney College as a reminder of Exeter Cathedral in Cornwall may help us to understand its intended purpose. And I surmise that part of its function was to act as a channel for two-way communication between the diocesan centre in Exeter and the parishes of the Cornish countryside. The bishops would have wanted to be sure that orthodox teaching and practices of Christianity would permeate through to the parishes, and also that what was being said and thought in the parishes would get back to the diocesan centre. Given the distinctive language of this part of Cornwall, that process would be helped by having parish priests with their rural contacts gathering together at a single place, which also had close links with Exeter. I would surmise that the links of Glasney with Exeter took place chiefly by sea, since both places lay on good harbours on the south coast. Exeter was very fortunate to have, as it were, ready-made this property that they owned just in the right place for doing what they wanted. To that extent, and only to that extent, we can surmise that part of the function of Glasney was to be Cornish speaking, and also to be English speaking, so that it could transmit ideas and practices between Exeter and rural Cornwall, acting as go-between or interpreter in both directions. The fact that its staff consisted of parish priests, part of whose duties was to bring Orthodox religion out into the parishes, was therefore an essential aspect of this suggested aspect of its function. And it's also in that context that we can now consider the Cornish plays which survive in the manuscripts. Somebody is saying the sound has gone entirely. Does that apply to everyone or just to me, just to one person?
I can hear you, Oliver. We are having a few questions about the sound, but it is fine on me, and other people are saying they can hear.
I'm trying to speak loudly and close up, so I'll go on doing that, but I'm glad most people can hear at any rate.
Thank you.
Considering the Cornish plays now, it's important to keep hold of the fact that when we link the plays with Glasney College, that is itself a surmise. There's nothing actually in any of the manuscripts to link any of them with Glasney, and there are people who question that link. One person has suggested that the whole of the Ordinalia was written at Bodmin, not Penryn. And although that idea is certainly misguided because of all the Penryn area place names in the text, we must recognise that while the link with Penryn is certain, the link with Glasney itself is only likely. Another person, pointing out that literacy wasn't entirely confined to the priesthood, but acknowledging the link to Penryn because of the place names, has implied that the Ordinalia could have been written by townspeople, not by members of the college. That's at least more possible, but my reason for disagreeing with that theory is that to write the Ordinalia, one would need not only to have been Latin literate, but also to have had access to a library for the apocryphal stories that are included in the plays. The cycle shows not merely literacy, but literacy at a high level. And for that reason, I think members of the college or people with access to its learning are likely. But whom was the cycle written for? One thing the priests certainly were not is a troupe of travelling actors, which has sometimes been implied. Actually producing the plays was not among their functions, and all that's known about the production of other biblical cycles elsewhere in England indicates that they were produced and acted by lay people. So if we want to speculate, we could envisage a text produced at Glasney College, perhaps by priests or by local townspeople with the help of priests, including the access and understanding of the literary texts that lie behind the Ordinalia, to be used by townspeople for production at Penryn. The other point to remember is that the texts of all play cycles evolved over time. What we've got is simply a snapshot of a continuous process. The late creation play is another snapshot from a later century, and there's evidence within the Ordinalia itself that it once included scenes that aren't there now. Could we go on to next slide, please? Thank you. Looking at these manuscripts together also emphasizes how the Ordinalia manuscript particularly is a fair copy, not an author's working copy, nor a copy for producing the plays from. There must have been other copies from which this one was taken and other ones made from this one, perhaps including extracts for individual actors. But really, we can have little idea of the process from manuscript to stage. But the Ordinalia, if you compare the Ordinalia manuscript with the other three, you'll see what a finely worked copy it is. As for what happened to the text once it existed, one place that I think doesn't receive enough attention lies near St. Gluvius Church, just outside Penryn, but on the other side from Glasney College. Near to it, there used to be a curved enclosure at a spot called Bohelland. Bohelland is so close to the church that St. Gluvius Church itself was sometimes called the Church of Bohelland. And I think it's likely that the second part of its name is actually the Cornish element lan, a church site, although I don't know what the first part is. Bohelland is actually named twice in the first play of the Ordinalia, once in a gift by King Solomon to the carpenters who worked on the temple in Jerusalem. You can see that text here, where he gave them not Bohelland itself, but Gweil Behethlan, Bohelland Fields. You can see it there in the third line of King Solomon's speech. Warbath all Gweil Behethlan, ha cors Penryn in Tien, mias re lemin duchri. I'll show you more about Gweil Behethlan, Bohelland Fields, in a moment. He also gave them cors Penryn, Penryn Wood, a particularly appropriate gift for the carpenters. And he gave them 5 farms, all within a mile or two of Penryn as well, now called Gwarda, here as Gwerddwr, Ennis, here as Anennis, Arwenach, here as Arwenach, Tregenva, here as Tregenva, and Cagiliac, here as Cagilec. Another Gruthiuqui charter, make of them a charter for yourselves. Any audience based at Penryn would know these names and what a remarkably generous payment they represented, along with Bohelland Fields and Penryn Wood, but they would mean nothing to an audience unfamiliar with the area. Next slide, please. The second occurrence of Bohelland in the cycle appears only 200 lines later in the same play, when the pre-Christian so-called bishop in Jerusalem rewards the torturers who've just beaten the apocryphal Maximilla to death for foretelling Christ and the Holy Trinity. He gave them 3 properties, which you can see in the 5th line, 6th line down here. Behethlan ha bosaneth, hagol chenanry and clause. In the bottom line of that speech. That's the episcopus, the bishop's speech. The canonry of the close, clearly referring to Glasney College itself, as we'll see in a moment. This seems a less generous gift. Bosaneth is a minor farm in Mornan parish, 3.5 miles away from Penryn, and I'm unclear exactly what the canonry of the close would mean as a gift. It sounds more like an appointment to a priesthood within the college. Anyway, for our purposes, Bohelland here is the interesting one. There's no inconsistency between this gift and that of King Solomon 200 lines earlier. He'd given away Bohelland Fields, the open field system outside the town, cultivated in strip fields, presumably by some of the townsfolk, whereas this bishop gave away the farmstead of Bohelland itself. What interests me is the site of Bohelland. Bohelland Fields, or Gweil Behethlen, is shown on a map of about 1580, preserved in the British Library. Next slide, please, which shows the town of Penryn. In this map, north is roughly at the top. It shows the town of Penryn, you can see it in the middle there, with the tidal creek coming up to the eastern lower end of the town, of the high street. The praise or meadow over below the northwest end of the town, which is still named as one drives into Penryn from the north today. And St. Gluvius or Gluis Church, right beside Bohelland Fields, which are named right at the bottom of the map. Also, but unnamed, thick woods, presumably the Bishop's Wood of Penryn or Cors Penryn, on the south side of the town, right beside the precinct of the college. And this precinct is presumably the close mentioned by the pre-Christian bishop. Even more excitingly, next slide please, the Lanhydrock Atlas in 1695, this time with north at the top, names Bohelland Farm itself, just up the hill from the church, and shows both of those in relation to Penryn town at the bottom of the slide. And if one homes in on the site of Bohelland, next slide please, it shows a circle of trees round the farmstead. This is a representation of the curved enclosure which was described by writers in the 1870s, 30 fathoms or 180 feet across. It was still shown show the first edition of the Ordnance Survey's 6-inch map of 1888. Next slide, please. In the same position, just up the hill from St. Luvius Church. You can see Bohelland's site of, and then the camp. You see that circular enclosure, which is the circle of trees shown on the Lanhydrock Atlas. And across the valley from the town of Penryn. Some of the hedges on this map still preserve the outlines of strips of Bohelland fields. You can see them there in the upper right quarter of the map, strip fields. So that is Bohelland fields named in the Ordinalia and on the earliest map. I'm confident that this site of Bohelland, although it's never named as a playing place, deserves more attention than it's received in recent years. Whoever wrote the Ordinalia, whether clergy at Glasney or townspeople under their guidance, I suspect that this was the site which they would have had in mind primarily or solely, where it was going to be performed. Whether the Ordinalia was also intended to be performed at other places in the western half of Cornwall, where people would understand the language, I'm less sure. Putting on a 3-day performance on that scale is a big undertaking, as people have shown in recent years. And my own guess is that people might be expected to travel to Penryn to see it performed, rather than being expected to put it on themselves in rural parishes. Unans Meriazek was a 2-day performance, so less ambitious, and had the town of Camborne to produce it, again, not a rural parish. We don't know the length of Bunan's Quay, and I'm unsure myself whether it was actually envisaged for practical performance. But technically, St. Kay's parish included the town of Truro. So if that play were to have been staged, there was again a major town nearby, 2 miles from Key's playing place, which could have helped with its production. Historically, it can be easy to be preoccupied by the surviving playing places, such as the one at St. Just, into overlooking the ones that haven't survived, of which I find Bohelland historically the most exciting. Of course, from a practical point of view, one must work with what survives, but that mustn't make us forget what once existed. Now, I've been supposing that the resources of towns were required for the restaging of dramas, but that may not be right, although it's notable that a town may have been involved in all the 3 medieval play cycles. Next slide, please. But I also wonder about Sidney Higgins's convincing suggestions about the use of the circular playing place for staging the plays. With our modern preconceptions, we tend to seek the audience round the perimeter, as Denny did back in 1969 and as has been done more recently. But Sidney Higgins has suggested that actually the audience was in the middle, and people would come down from their stations, the actors, to act in the middle, and you'd find yourself in the middle of the action. These ideas were mentioned in the symposium that was held a couple of weeks ago, but not, I think, what seemed to me to be the 2 enormous benefits of having the audience standing in the central circle. First, it makes the action far more immediate for them. If you find yourself part of the crowd that is calling for Jesus to be crucified, it'll bring home the enormity of what was done far more intensely than if you're viewing it from the side. So having the audience in the central plane adds to the same effect as that provided by the use of local place names, namely making the biblical story immediate and relevant for the local audience. The other thing that is achieved is that you don't need such a large cast, for example, to achieve crowd scenes, because the audience is doing part of the work for you. And in this context, I note that circular playing places have also been suggested to have existed in East Anglia, another very rural area. I don't know whether that's from physical remains or from manuscript evidence. So I wonder whether, in fact, this circular method of staging medieval drama, using the audience as the crowd, as suggested by Sidney Higgins, may even have been a widespread practice all over England as a solution to how to stage dramas in rural areas using a limited cast. But I know very little about the staging of medieval drama elsewhere in England, so that's speculation on my part. I mention it only because it's worth bearing in mind that although these manuscript plans are unique as survivals, our circular playing places themselves may not have been as unique as we like to think. This is the first of the 3 stage plans for the Ordinalia, the one for Origo Mundi, with Caelum, heaven, at the top, Infernum, hell, off to the left, the Tortores between them, and the pre-Christian bishop opposite the Tortores on the same level. There it says Episcopus, and the 3 kings, Solomon, David, and Pharaoh, completing the circle at the bottom. The second plan, next slide please, follows the same pattern. I note that on this one, there's no place for Jesus or the apostles on the perimeter. One could imagine Jesus being based in heaven with the good centurion on his left-hand side, top right there, centurio. But the other stations are occupied by bad characters, including the position of hell, which isn't named here, but its position is occupied by the academics, the learned doctores. And on the plan for the third play, slide 9, next slide please, hell is back again, very importantly here for Christ's harrowing of it, with Pilate conveniently cited just below it, Pilatus. Now, I should also consider the connection of the 2 saints plays with Glasney College now. Here the connection is less obvious. Both plays contain local place names, but they're names from within their respective parishes, not ones around Penryn, which itself serves to emphasize how Penryn focused the Ordinalia itself is. The manuscript of Bunan's Meriazic, next slide please, contains 2 circular plans, like the 3 for the Ordinalia. They follow the same pattern, with Caelum, heaven, at the top, and on this one with Tortores and Infernum, hell, squashed up right next to it, and the Emperor Constantine at the bottom opposite heaven, Constantinus there. The first plan uniquely stipulates a piece of scenery in the middle of the playing place, the Capella, with Meriazic built and used at Camborne in some of the scenes of the first day of play. But that doesn't appear in the second day's plan, which is less carefully drawn, next slide please, and which has no action in Cornwall to allow for. I think that writing within the platea, this playing place, on that one isn't to do with scenery. I think it's some later edition, but I've been unable to decipher it fully, so I'm not sure. So what is there to connect the 2 saints plays with Glasney? You'll all know that until 20 years ago, only Meriazic was known, not Bunan's Cave. Already in that state of knowledge, a link with Glasney College was surmised for Bunan's Meriazic, because no fewer than 3 provosts of the college were rectors of Camborne parish at some date, culminating in John Nance, who had been provost of the college and became rector by exchanging his position with the then current rector in 1501. So when the manuscript of Bunan's Meriazic was written in 1504, the current rector of the parish had formerly been provost of Glasney, and the current provost of Glasney, Alexander Penhill, was a former rector of Camborne. David Frost has shown also that the vicar of Crowan, the next parish to the south, was Ralph Trelubus, another canon of the college, and his curate later was Richard Tone, probably to be identified with the scribe who wrote the original manuscript of the play in 1504. In addition to these circumstances, Glasney seemed a very likely place where the written knowledge of the Breton Latin life of the saint would have become known because of Glasney's maritime links through Penryn with Brittany itself. But Camborne itself was not a parish that belonged to the college. So these surmised links between Bunan's Meriazic and Glasney comprised only external evidence of this circumstantial kind. That changed with the discovery of Bunan's Cave, for that text belongs to a parish directly owned by the college and thus intrinsically connected with it. And furthermore, and crucially, there are textual and thematic links between Bunan's Cave and Bunan's Meriazic, showing that whichever one was written first, the author of the second of these 2 plays knew the first one. So this shared context and phrasing between the 2 plays shows that they came from a single intellectual milieu. So the association which was already surmised between Buenos Meriasek and the college is confirmed by the text of Buenos K, which has links with both, completed the triangle. Next slide, please. Whether there were other such plays for any other parishes remains an interesting but unknowable question. The existence of playing places doesn't prove anything, since they may also have been used for other activities, such as sports. Already in the 13th century, there was a playing place called Plaistow in Rame parish opposite Plymouth, well before medieval drama as we know it had arisen generally in England, let alone in Cornwall. I'm certain that not every parish in West Cornwall will have had a saint's play. The only other one that is rumoured to have existed is for St. Columb, yet another town. There won't have been one for St. Moran of Lamorran, for example, who as a saint is normally only mentioned as part of the place name, and whose parish contained only 12 taxpayers even before the Black Death. If there were any more plays, I'd expect them to be of saints for some of the other parishes belonging to Glasney College, and on present patterns may be ones for whom there might be some evidence for written Breton Latin material about the saint. On that basis, Budoc might be the strongest candidate. Finally, I should just mention the other Cornish texts. The Passion poem has textual links with the Passion play of the Ordinalia, so that puts it into the same intellectual circle. And the Creation play, written later, has textual links with the first play of the Ordinalia, so once again, we know it was in some way connected with that cycle, even though it was written after Glasney College had been dissolved. The final piece of the puzzle was filled in when David Frost showed that the 12 Tregear homilies were translated by a priest in the Glasney parish of St. Alan, north of Truro, and that Thomas Stephen, translator of the 13th text in that manuscript, Sacrament and Altar, was Ralph Trelawis's curate at Newlyn East, the adjacent parish to St. Alan. So all those texts have close links to Glasney College as well, although they too were written after the college had ceased to exist. So that's it. I hope that I've been able to give some idea of the context and background of the place which is likely to have provided at least the intellectual milieu from which our Cornish plays arose. Thank you very much.